Wonderful. Thank you for joining us. I am very honored to introduce our first keynote speaker of the day, Dr. Ted Blackmon. After decades of pioneering efforts in the areas of lean and agile AWP construction methodologies, the capital projects industry is at the point of broader mass adoption of these innovative approaches to project management. A picture book tour of the historical background and evolution of digital project management techniques, coincidental with the evolution of computers and information technology, informs us as to where we have come from. To many, this will be thought-provoking and challenge the notion that construction is not an innovative industry. So then, where are we going next? A vision of the future suggests that the fundamental relationship between planning and scheduling for our projects with people and organizations at the center is poised to be a key aspect in the next stage evolution for digital project management techniques worldwide. Please mute your microphones and use the chat to type in your questions, and our session moderator will ask those of Dr. Blackmon at the end of the session. And so without further ado, I'll turn things over to Dr. Ted Blackmon. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Really appreciate being here, Reva, and I'm just needing to share my screen. It says I've got to stop someone else from sharing, so I'm taking a chance and clicking that button. I hope everyone can hear me okay, and let me get my presentation up. It's, these virtual symposiums really open up the chance for increased collaboration. Really excited to be here. Thanks for the introduction of the topic. To start off, here's my joke. Well, this is not me. And so I imagine quite a few of you in the audience likely saw The Martian, and this is Matt Damon. So although that's not me, this was the system that helped launch my career, believe it or not, into construction. You're going to get a little bit more detail on that. And this is the imager from Mars Pathfinder. The movie The Martian was very realistic in its use of the technology, although I think as the movie wound it to the end, kind of the ending part may have trailed a little bit, but as Matt Damon's character was stranded on Mars, his use of the image from Mars Pathfinder, this is a camera system where I worked as part of a team on the Mars Pathfinder mission and taking these thumbnail postage stamp images and automatically simming them together on a supercomputer to produce these very high resolution panoramas of 360-degree views in stereo. This is me in mission control with a set of virtual binoculars where you could rotate around and see the landscape in stereo. And kind of my 15 minutes of fame came from being part of a team that developed this Mars map software to basically develop plans as the schedules changed, and that's a key part of the theme going forward. We built work packages in essence to automate not just one schedule but multiple schedules up to the Mars lander. I'll come back to some of the history and tie it back into the big loop, but on that theme of the talk, this is a quote from Maya Angelou. You can read it there yourself, but it really, and there's been a number of similar quotes. And it was something for me that, I was asked to give a keynote almost a decade ago. It was AWP was just more formally getting off the ground in Canada, face-to-face in Calgary. And I decided for that keynote, well, where did all this come from? The idea that, CPM scheduling has always been there. My entry into the industry was, scheduling was just something that, was always there and we did. And so it became a bit of an exploration. And also I'd gone through pretty much a decade at that point. This would be circa 2012, where I did this. I'm not going to walk you through this entire history, but I went back and basically I didn't have a job. I quit my job to start ConstructX, and at that point was just figuring out where I'm going, next in my journey of my career. And so I spent quite a bit of time researching some things, and for the presentation put together this fairly exhaustive research initiative of the history of construction and specifically innovation. Part of the recurring theme, I'd always get into meetings where my history as a consultant, I've been in the area of technology and suddenly entered into consultancy, but I hear a lot of other consultants make statements like, well, construction is so laggard and really not an innovative industry. And what I'm going to show you here is I actually think it's quite the opposite. It's just a time delayed adoption. And so as we go through some of the earliest things ever made, this is just a beautiful shot of one of the earliest man-made structures ever that's been uncovered. And certainly there must have been something before this. And as you go through the Neolithic age to these incredible things where we wonder, well, how were they built and who did it and how did they have the knowledge to do it? And you get into, I mean, a great example where I found, in terms of innovation, the Roman Colosseum. And yes, it wasn't information technology innovation, but the introduction of concrete and cement and the idea of how do you form things, and the water ducts and aqueducts were ultimately built. Even though things got introduced, it takes some time for new introductions into the way we build things. And obviously, given that our habitats and the things we not only build for what we live in, but then where we gather and do things such as worship, generate and takes, it's a massive part of our economy overall. So quite a bit of investment does go into doing things new. And as you go further through the age of an enlightenment and get into other innovations that came in and continue on through into the industrial revolution era, which I kind of coined. And it's part of my background from Common Point when I took the NASA technology out, was jumping into innovations in the late 1990s, early 2000s in the area of 4D. I love this picture, which was clearly not a computer 4D model, but 4D takes 3D and adds time. So it was kind of a picture representation of the Eiffel Tower being built, and the construction techniques to rapidly erect that structure were very impressive. That's an interesting thing to go back on. And big projects like the Hoover Dam introduced. And it was not just at this time, but I noted something very interesting that that mid-year of the 1900s, as we got into 1935, a formal establishment for the construction management program, the Rinker School of Construction Management in Florida. Was one of the first programs, if not the first program in the world, certainly the first program in the States that formalized construction management as a discipline. But as I kind of went through and then went from this industrial revolution into the information age, why a bit of an aha effect came for me through this research, and I termed this event the Delta Shift. And that'll take just a little bit of explanation. Certainly want to be into some discussions of the future and hopefully not bore you too much of the past. But there's a couple things that happened, and one was what I termed the disappearance of the master builder, and another point being the entering of the information age. I'm just going to adjust the video image on my screen so I can see on the right. And these two events happened coincidentally, although I think the disappearance of the master builder was building up, and it's not that they're still. I mean, that term could be a loaded term per se, but I myself, I went through the School of Engineering at Penn State and UC Berkeley as a mechanical engineer, but boy, I dreamed of being an architect since a young age and felt like I could always get into building things, and decided rather than go into architectural engineering, I went into mechanical engineering. But maybe just something simple most people know, but this idea of an architect. The word architect originally was the idea that you'd have a representative. And Imhotep from Egypt is one of the first documented master builders, where they understood everything about the project and everything that was being built. They really became the representative for, in essence, what we might call the owner, who was in putting the initiative up to drive the building of something by leveraging massive capital resources. But now today we think of the architect as an isolated discipline. And so as we became more specialized and we're able to build bigger things and apply more innovation and more technologies into it, the fragmentation effect came in to where now the architect and the engineer and the constructor, they've got very different views of the world. And contract management, especially around that Hoover Dam era and before, suddenly coming into where projects now have contract packages. And is the project manager the master builder? Not necessarily. It's a discipline in of itself. So we've now got all these disciplines, and sometimes just getting teams and disciplines of those teams to understand each other and see the bigger picture perspective, I believe, has been lost on the projects. Whereas that original role of the master builder to optimize the project and have a full understanding of how that asset that's being built is intended to be used and what it's for, and the break up into these specialized roles that together maybe build a mastermind. But the other major, and what may be an even more significant event from a shift of the whole economy, was the introduction of the transistor. And in 1947, that came along. And something that shocked me was, well, I didn't know one of the first, if not the first, computer programs ever written was for project management for construction and scheduling. And how many of you knew that out there? It'd be one of the polls I'd love to hear. I mean, so in 1957, got Walter Cronkite showing up at DuPont, where it was a project to use, one of the earliest computers to come in, and there were similar efforts happening in Europe with ICI that's now transformed into a number of companies, and you might know them better in terms of derivative of INEOS, but ICI was basically the largest chemical company in Britain who were developing, and the Navy was also developing scheduling. So scheduling and project management, but for a capital facility project. And the savings that they had on that project was quite phenomenal. And if you think just about, the idea of doing a backward pass CPM algorithm and doing your forward pass and backward pass, I mean, that idea was conceptualized, but trying to do it without a computer technology just wasn't feasible. So there are certain things that can be done. And even though DuPont saved 25% on their shutdowns, interesting thing happened. It really didn't continue on. It kind of dropped and the project team disbanded. And that's one of the things in the capital projects industry. It almost takes a generation to go from an innovation to where it just becomes, like I said, whenever I entered into the capital projects industry, I just thought scheduling was always there. Didn't quite question, where did these Gantt charts and CPM methodology, critical path methodology come from? I also, and I had known this one before, but one of the first programs ever that had a computer human interface, Ivan Sutherland out of MIT, it was again for 3D models. So it wasn't like 3D, it was a more recent innovation, both manufacturing, but also again, capital projects on how could you generate line diagrams on a 2D computer screen from projections of 3D images of something to be built. And they actually had it hooked up to head-mounted displays, which was part of what I did at UC Berkeley. So I'd already done a bit of computer research history and just found that flew in the face of this idea of capital projects industry not being innovative. The two of the first programs, one being just the data-driven CPM, and then as a user interface came out, it being again targeted towards use cases for 3D modeling in the capital projects industry. That probably will be a surprise to many in the audience. But similar to that point on adoption, if you look from 1957, Primavera, which has kind of become the gold standard for project management, really introducing itself in '83. Look at the time delay between that. And there were other innovations, Zachary Construction, HB Zachary, a stalwart in Texas. I'm down here in Houston. So a shout out to the Houston Astros and congratulations to the Braves, but being from Houston, and I've got a personal journey with Zachary that I'm going to share as well. HB Zachary, prior to Primavera, trailblazed their own, that was Zachary Construction, building one of the major transit systems, scheduling before this. So there certainly were scheduling applications. If y'all out there, there's some great references. This is a reference on the history of Primavera, but it really now has become, again, something that's just used. But what I also find interesting is, we're now in this period of, well, we're still kind of using it the same way we used it. I know I may be offending some that have more innovative uses, and it's nothing to do with the limitations of Oracle's P6. That's, Primavera got acquired by Oracle in the period in between here, but it's time to really rethink, I believe, where we are. And that was my personal journey. So what does NASA have to do with construction? It was a group of owner operators that actually approached us as part of the Mars Pathfinder mission. I actually entered into a NASA technology incubator, one of the first startup incubators in the world, co-located it with the NASA Ames campus in Silicon Valley. And if you touch a moving vehicle down on the surface of Mars, it's a very different problem than having an orbiter go around Mars. And what's the big difference? There's a technical term, and just prior to this presentation today, the past couple of days, I've been hunting for it. I'm sure it's somewhere, but it deals with your window of planning reliability. So as you build a plan, how long can you rely on that plan? If you're sending an orbiter around, it's still rocket science, but the orbital dynamics and mechanics very difficult, but you've got a fairly stable environment for your scheduling of rocket fires and your imaging sequences, where yes, you may get hit by a comet or something may go wrong, but your plan can lead into a schedule and you can rely upon that schedule. But again, going back to touching a rover down on the surface of Mars in the 1996 timeframe, where Mars map and the planning systems that would built using virtual reality to make not one schedule, but would upload multiple schedules, contingent schedules, and said, well, if this doesn't go right, it was less than a day. We knew that we'd send commands up and it was very likely that your first attempt to do something didn't work. And then you go to that, take that to construction. And the reality is, I mean, it depends upon the type of project and the size, but it faces this core dilemma, which is no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. I believe something that just fundamentally we've lost sight of is a plan, a schedule, and a CPM schedule relies upon having a relatively fixed plan structure of start finish activities, and you're assuming that your plan holds. And even with AWP, advanced work packaging, some misinterpretations have become, well, I'm just doing all the planning up front, then I'm going to go execute. No, the development was take agile planning, scheduling methodologies out of NASA and provide an iterative planning. What do you do if suddenly your plan changes? And we struggle with that on our capital projects. It's not the only industry. Some of the move away from waterfall techniques were actually in the systems integration and software side of NASA, where I picked it up, where it's like you're sitting in a meeting and the project management's expecting a report against schedule line items, and I'm sitting there thinking, I'm not even working on that. I'm working on other stuff. How do you deal with that? So this ability to iterate a plan and adjust the schedule and have multiple views of where the schedule goes in the future is fundamental. That led to, in the circa 2000 timeframe, we're still moving forward. This isn't even the future. This was the past. 20 plus years ago, bringing in, and this was Petro-Canada shutdown turnaround example of how could you come in and tie Primavera against a virtual construction model in real time and have your tie points and your scaffolding and your access and pull heat exchangers. This doesn't even really exist as a robust product anymore. Only certain pieces of the AWP automation, notably, hey, I want to make a video game environment where I can click on my pipe, build a work package, automate the material list, tie detailed production planning as a roll-up. In the case of shutdown turnarounds, you've got these very detailed schedules. But the major advent wasn't just this innovative virtual environment, twofold. One was, wow, to pull all this together, you're not just leveraging a 3D model, this fantasy that we're going to have a BIM model in the cloud, and that BIM model is going to have everything. Even in the vertical AEC market, that's not a reality. Most of the data you need for planning and tracking are in other stakeholder systems. So I had to pull that data in and consolidate it, because the person in the field needs the right materials and the right information at the right time. That doesn't just come from a single data source, it's an aggregation. And most of these datas don't even turn on until later in the project. And so, hats off to some of the Syncrude and early KBR last planner tools. But as I came out of NASA, I'm going to give high credit to Dr. Glenn Ballard, who is one of the pioneers of lean construction, partnered up with Glenn Ballard and Dr. Martin Fisher at the Center for Integrated Facilities Engineering. I took a summer series course at Stanford, learned about 4D, and I said, this paradigm needs flipped. If you're trying to take a 3D model and link it to a schedule, where'd the plan come from? And hence OpSim was born, to have these early planning and very detailed planning iterations. And through the history of that, it turned into an acquisition of that technology called ConstructSim into a company called Bentley Systems. The Construction Owners Association of Alberta was very much involved in the development of workplace planning as a technique. And I initiated the research proposal following the acquisition by Bentley that turned into RT272. Was then able to convince CII to allow a technology vendor to join, because what I found was more, rather than teaching how to do, use this great new technology, it was more, finding out most companies didn't really have a very good definition of how they would build packages, not just the contract packages, but break that down into sub packages for execution and sequence them against the schedule. It's a disconnect. Now that's come a long way over a 10-year period, where now AWP is a standard. and we're going to start to look forward. But there's some key concepts that I kind of want to help convey out to the audience. One is, it wasn't just this, get the right materials to the right people at the right time at the work face level, where that's the biggest impact on project productivity, was saying, take that planning reliability window. And whereas on Mars, it was less than a day, the most recent Mars missions, if you track any of them, they're now up to multiple days to weeks of plans that can be uploaded. And in construction, we're still kind of at that 3-week look ahead, although it depends again on the size and type of the project. But generally, the plans get consistent. But even then, most projects are often in the fire, in the field every day. But what the lean construction and then the AWP introduced was, well, if we can get 3 to 4 weeks of highly reliable plans with the materials there, with the equipment there that you're going to need to build it, with all the drawings and the latest versions of the drawings and the instructions and these great pictures that show people what they need to do, and you can't take the people element out, but you give a project team those 3 weeks of reliable plans, productivity doubles. It's amazing to see that. And it's been documented and proven. 2 for 10 takes 2% of investment. And a lot of that investment, yes, a fair amount of it goes to the tech, but it's far more on the people side. I'm going to touch upon this before. The introduction of technology doesn't actually displace people, it added people. It said now we need planners who are going to use these tools to build plans before the teams in the field are struggling with what am I building tomorrow or next day and trying to pull it together. And so I believe that's a general trend, but the economic payback is phenomenal. Owners have gone to mandating it. AWP's gone worldwide. So this isn't as simple as, I'll just let you read it. This isn't the knock joke, but I kind of put this one there. It's that disconnect. Let's come back and talk a little bit about it. The architect saying, are we there yet? And that sometimes is the owner. Owners can be their own worst enemy. And so often what they ask for and the push for schedule and production may not give the cash flow and the information needed for the constructors to actually get their job done. And they're the ones that tend to have to say my brain hurts because they're getting often blamed for things going wrong. And I know it doesn't mean that they're innocent in this dysfunctional collaborative relationship that the capital projects industry has been in, which just causes not only massive failures on mega projects, then you go down to your smaller projects and it's the opposite effect. It's not overruns, it's padding of estimates and underutilization of capital. We need to convert and do tank, extension programs and upgrade and bring new products in. And so the use of capital becomes very inefficient on the smaller projects. But a question out, I'll give you the answer, but it'd be another great one. If I was in a live audience, I'd have a few people shout out, who do you think were the most resistant of the people? The initial owners like Petro-Canada and BP and Chevron and Dow that brought the introduction of AWP forward in early 2000, thought the constructors were going to be resistant. They're the ones that don't have computer savviness. They're going to say, oh, no, I can't do this. Just the opposite. The visibility supplied, it really became project controls and project management. There was a risk aversion, and then project controls, it is the future. And I think that just lack of, well, hold on, you're moving my cheese and now a plan, you're showing me that my schedule is no longer valid. I don't want to know that. And engineering really doesn't want observability. My PhD was in project controls, but not for capital projects, in an area of what's called supervisory control and literally control. But rather than applying my time and effort to control problems where you factor the human out, supervisory control is like the Mars Pathfinder mission. You've got a whole team of people coming together to solve something. And how do you apply? And the reality is, and again, I apologize if I offend people, but I'm going to make a bold statement. Our projects today are out of control. I mean, one of the fundamental theories for making a stable control system is you need to prove with your sensors that you've got adequate observability and you've got adequate controllability. There's an misquoted thing that says, well, without data, it's impossible to manage or control a project. That's actually the wrong quote. The quote is, it's unfortunate, and I'm not saying it the right way, but it's a disservice to think that, management can't be done without the data. It's just you can't optimize it. You can't technically do continuous improvement and reliably make it better unless you put the proper levels of observability and controllability. And project managers get it done every day. Projects get built. But I'll go back to my point. At a theoretical fundamental level, they're out of control in most situations. But the technology can bring it forward. We come to, this is now the modern day, AWP has now become an industry standard, and owners and major EPC contractors now have tools where they can reach in and say, well, to make these AWP systems work, I can put contract specifications in, because in order to get this highly collaborative planning environment that's going to provide such a significant savings, I need to get data, and we're in a data-driven world. How do I get data? It doesn't just come from the engineer. It doesn't just come from project controls. And so there's now the AWP digital threads that was a follow-on from the earlier specification of AWP as methodologies. There's those that say, well, it's just a process. Not true. AWP encompasses people first and foremost. If you don't put those planners into doing that upfront planning, it doesn't work. I mean, then now you're back in the field, struggling with the teams in the field, trying to figure out how to iterate their plans on a daily and weekly basis. So you've got to add the people, and you add in the process, you add in the technology. Going back to my PhD studies at UC Berkeley in the area of supervisory control, Dwayne McCruer was one of the first pioneers in aviation and vehicular dynamics and supervisory control, where a human is in the loop. And his thesis was, you can't separate the man from the machine, meaning the technology and tools that we're using directly influence the procedure and processes that we're doing, that then describe how the humans and what they're doing. And to think from again, which goes back to, I'd hear large consultancies and even many project teams where you present, they're like, well, I just need to define the process first, then I'll introduce the technology. You're missing the fundamental point. They're intertwined. And the technology is not an all or nothing. It's deciding what pieces of technology you're going to use. And then specifically, not just the data you need, but what becomes super critical is who's given that data and who's using it. And how do you tie that relationship together? Because people need to support it. It's information flow across project team members that become essential. And we now have a basis of not only having contractual specifications, but with one of the innovative startups coming out of the Jovian Venture Network that I'm involved with, launching multiple startups in the capital projects industry, you can manage those digital threads, bring them in independent of whatever planning tools. And this isn't some database representation. It's showing different project participants where that data is coming into an integrated environment. And again, it's not going to be fed from one, and that information needs to flow and then integrate in with the project management tools being used, from estimating through the various areas all the way through the closeout of the project. And it's essential. Much of the detail is designed by these master EPC program management teams, but the reality is most of the design happens at the vendor level. And if you don't bring that pipe fabrication, steel fabrication data in, you can't get it. But if you sit those digital threads on top of a machine learning database, so that now you can clean up the data and produce high quality information, and the information is going to be misaligned. Why? It's a dynamic process. It goes back to, there was certainly a misunderstanding, that I even had as I did some early learnings in lean construction, and around this idea of impossible problems. And there are certain problems that just can't be solved. And whenever I went and gave a presentation back to the group at NASA I came out of, one of my mentors, Steve Ellis, said, this isn't this is not a class of a problem that's not solved. Capital project problems are solved all the time. It's a highly dynamic problem. Things are changing. What you can count on is change happens. It's not a stable environment. And so as the change is happening, because processes are in parallel, the data is not going to sync up. But it's not just about the data integration. And as we look to say, okay, well, what's the other, where are we not at and where are we going? If we relate it back to tools that we'd put in place over 20 years ago at NASA, we produced contingency schedules. We produced multiple schedules, again, that a computer could help provide look aheads into the future. But right now we're still relying upon a relatively fixed construction project management schedule, and then producing look aheads that are a single look ahead and giving us some cone of variability that we can run some Monte Carlo simulations on, but what we really need is multiple paths in the future. And that's where computers, and it won't take the human out of the loop, as we were doing this at the NASA Research Center and then deploying those type of capabilities onto Mars Pathfinder for operational control. You're going to increase the number of humans to look at these different alternative options and be ready with backup plans that say, well, if this doesn't happen, I can do this, and give me variability of the futures. And then you keep the current actuals up to date with the path that you actually went down. And the level of using AI to be able to automate these multiple contingent branches then doesn't become a single branch in a schedule, it becomes a contingent branch. And coming back to tying people in, very excited. I mean, you can't do this without working with the teams that are in the projects actually happening it. Toyota Corporation is one of the major EPC, and especially an EP centric. You know, again, went back to, like, for years, engineers didn't want to participate. Why? It gave such a visibility of engineering delays that you'd think they're more computer savvy, they'd be into it. But now they are realizing that by adopting digital production, that really comes down to projects are a one-off of a production system and the core underlying framework of applying lean. But projects in construction can't be lean like manufacturing, where you just make them more efficient, more efficient. You got to have the agility, because your plan is going to be constantly changing, because change is what happens. And so how do you tie the communication from the constructors on evolving need dates to where there's evolving need dates on your engineering work package? And then the engineers don't engineer by the sequence of construction, but you can pull that data together. And we are on the precipice of going from projects that are largely, and it doesn't mean a horse and buggy's out of control, so the analogy from control, but certainly, you know, having a governor for our projects that can get our projects with the proper level of observability and the proper level of controllability, such that now we can apply more computer automation optimization algorithms, where optimization won't be just a buzzword used by marketing, but where literally AI algorithms can drive optimization. Again, won't factor the human out of the loop. It'll bring the human right into the loop. I just wanted to do a quick time check on the presentation. Apologize for dropping out. That's what we found, again, going back to the, you know, and this isn't the future, but building upon it. You know, the hardest part of making AWP work, the technology is tough, and getting the data right was tough, because the data doesn't come from one place. But the biggest part was convincing projects, because projects estimate on the way they did it before, that you got to add in. You can't have the engineers support the technology for construction and commissioning. We need to have dedicated people that are going to help out once engineering produces the data and the drawings to support the use of technology. And so George Delgado, formerly from Jacobs in Houston, who was on one of the first majorly successful AWP projects in 2004, he said, Ted, you're defining a whole new breed of a constructor in new construction positions. We don't have these people. And this idea that you know, evolved in parallel on the Gulf Coast and in Canada, this idea of you got to take somebody from the field who is actually not the manager, but who's at the craft level, who maybe in the future might become a manager. And it can't be a dead-end position. It needs to be a way of taking foremen who get into the early management role. And then depending upon the project, this work-based planner then works for senior management and ducks under, but really interfaces down to the team, and in a matrix way works directly for a superintendent or a general foreman to build the detailed plans in the contingencies and track constraints and what's stopping the work from happening in the field. So it's introducing people into the project management system that didn't exist before. And gosh, if you got to try to convince a risk-averse project manager to include extra people in the budget, and they had never had those roles before, that became the biggest thing. And it's not going to stop as we introduce more techniques to optimize our projects and make this iterative planning and scheduling, where the schedules don't just become stale contract documents, but can actually be reflective. It doesn't mean that a baseline schedule of here's where the contract milestones were set, but almost everyone that's been in capital projects knows somebody else has got another schedule of what you're actually doing versus what the project management payout schedule is. And so having multiple schedules connected in parallel of plan, actual, and then not just one forecast, but here's my different options of forecast. That's going to drive increased roles into the industry, not eliminate those roles. It won't eliminate jobs. It will make capacity better. And if I come back to where I got started from in this journey, it wasn't to just make capital projects more efficient. It was a fundamental understanding coming through my days at Berkeley with my life mentor, Dr. Larry Stark, who, as I understood, he applied control system theory into the human brain and how the brain controls movement and vision and what I'm looking at. And he had great ideas all the way back from the 50s and 60s of the biggest control system that we ever know of is our biosphere and the planet. And it's not a computer control system. It's a careful balance of inputs and outputs and stabilizations. And we're at risk. I mean, we don't have unlimited resources. We engineer a throwaway society. I did not know that then. I know that now. As we came out of the early, Great Depressions of the 1920s, a lot of thought leaders said, we need to be able to build stuff, have people buy it, then they throw it away so we can build more stuff. I get it. That made our industrial revolution supercharged, and I'm very proud to be, in a capital economy, but we've got to figure out how to not recycle, but rather upcycle. That should really say upcycle. And the capital project industry can become the biggest consumer of materials we throw away from food and consumer products. But it's also about the energy industry transforming, and the drive for us to retool our capital projects on Earth becomes a key motivator of what I think will become the impetus to get these more intelligent AI planning systems in place for our capital projects industry. So I've left quite a little bit of time so that I'd have some questions, and certainly happy to go back and hit upon other points. Gives you a bit of a glimpse of, again, the key thesis that, a plan only survives, as long as it's reliable. It's that first battle, and then the plans start to change. What do you do when your plan changes? One last quote, if everything looks like a nail and all you have is a hammer, there's a real good quote about you just keep using the same tool. And this idea that the schedules get built after a plan gets built, then we go build it and execute, needs to be fundamentally rethought at the Project Management Institute level. And certainly agile definitions in other sectors have been very well defined, but capital projects is not dissimilar from other dynamic environments. It's in fact perhaps one of the most heightened dynamic environments of projects we live in. So this is the part of Ted, for that. Well, you're welcome. You're welcome. I was going to say, hoping to get the questions in. I've been in a few other virtual events. This becomes a moment of truth.
There are a few questions. One from, you might know the former VP of Sanko Energy, Ron Genero.
Oh yeah,
He's asking, can you please suggest one strategy industry initiative that we as an industry should focus on to increase the productivity?
Yeah, I really think that's a challenging question. I don't have an immediate answer for it now. Kind of echo, like the fragmentation that I talked about in AEC, we tend to have fragmentation of initiatives. And even though AWP emanated from Lean, we've now got, thoughts going on saying somehow production planning isn't the same as AWP. And it's like, well, hold on. And then we've got so many industry consortiums with them having different focus areas. And so I don't have the answer of which one, but I would echo that if we could combine efforts and consolidate, it would really help of rather being so dispersed with so many different initiatives going on in parallel across different industry think tanks and academic forums and practical forums. It's a challenge.
Thank you. And the next question is, how do you manage a plan when it changes during midway in a capital project?
Well, that's where capital projects live, don't they? And from a not what I'm seeing happening, but what we should be doing is monitoring that deviation. The reality is you build a path of construction, and here's how I want to build it, but then you don't attack it immediately according to that. And it's not true to say, if a work front's available and there's time to market pressures, you want to start building, but as the plan will deviate. and begin deviating from the schedule, but we're hung up on rebaselining, being hung up on the contractual aspects. And so having collaborative contracting strategies come in to where then is that you want your baseline is very important. And part of what we did was we didn't change the baseline for mission control. There were certain objectives and things over that first. I mean, the Mars Pathfinder rover lasted 88 days. It was only scheduled and promoted to the public to be 30, but there was a schedule, and we're planning down at the lower level. And then at some point your plan and your schedules, disconnect, but you need to have a higher level baseline plan and have multi-tiered plans. And at that detailed constructor level 4, let's say if an EPC plan by CWP is your baseline, you want to give flexibility for that to be adjusted underneath and then measure the difference and recalibrate the schedules against the updated plans on a more frequent basis. And I think, again, if we try to do that with just, without computers helping us, it's hard to do, because just generating those schedules themselves took so much time to nail down, and they are contractual aspects to it. So not an easy answer, but it's at the heart of what needs to be solved, is that iteration and stabilization, of the schedules that are built upon the initial assumption of a plan that can then be measured and monitored in terms of the delta more appropriately. And it's not so much even just measuring the delta, but then having collaborative techniques to update the plan to match the reality, so that then the plans that drive the schedules can update a schedule on a more frequent basis.
We have another question around how the risk management strategies are evolving and where the risk management is heading currently.
Yeah, and I didn't include that. I mean, just from the standpoint of time, and I was kind of glad I delivered this and it didn't go too long. But it's essential. And going back to some industry initiatives, there's been so much focus on AWP, and it's almost become stale. And it's like lean constructions, hit that same wall where what we tend to do is we want to standardize. And so once something's defined, say, oh, that's the best practice. Well, if you're not evolving it, the fundamental aspect of AWP was advancing. I mean, whenever I proposed it was enhancing work packaging, not advanced. And then it was like, well, they put an EWP definition in. I'd never really even seen an EWP. I'd only been working with CWPs that related to the engineering data and drawings. But point being, the enhancing not only switched to advancing, the ing got dropped and it was advanced, which means, oh, now it's a static definition. But back to the point of both Ty and Ron's question about industry initiatives, the future of project controls needs fundamentally restructured, and risk management is at the heart of it. And as you're looking at these different contingencies and looking at what alternatives there are, a increased automation around risk management for the scenario plannings. So as you're looking at your scenario planning situation, you can have risk be a heightened aspect of decision making around which ones are the one I go down versus the risk level. So rather than thinking of risk just as a negative, and moving the contingencies back to what they should be, where an owner contingency is, I'm making a change to the plan, I've got some reserve, I don't burn through my contingency just because my estimate was driven to be less than what it was going to take. And that tie-in with estimation as a reality check needs to be tied better into risk management. So I think there's a whole theme around the planning and risk management relationship that is essential for the future of project controls in capital projects.
Ted, Ron has a follow-up question on, sounds like you're supporting the collaborative contracting as an enabler for project success.
Yeah, I don't know if IPD, I mean, what kind of happened was interesting was, as AWP initially with lean construction, what I found was, if you remove that work phase planner and had the planning being done by somebody in the field, safety was an issue. So it was essential to define that work phase planner. But IPD, integrated project delivery, had great success for lean into the hospital industries and in the more heavy industries and that I've been traditionally applying and AWP has been applied to. We just don't have it. There was a CII research study on industrial integrated project delivery, And like AWP, it was one of the most stark. It was like, if you want to complete on time and have a reliable schedule, adopt IIPD. But I don't know if IIPD, but I mean, is the limiter to that in terms of one approach to collaborative, but you need to get the incentives aligned. And ultimately the owner has the biggest risk. And if you think that a lump sum transfers that risk, it transfers some responsibility to where change orders will eat you alive. And having it so that the benefit automation and innovative approaches can have incentives, because it generally, to make it work, you're generally, in this diagram, if you'd have an organizational chart of multiple companies, you'd say, well, the steel fabricator needs to do something a little bit more so the constructor in the field can benefit. That's an increased cost in one area to benefit another, but all the stakeholders should have some uplift in the benefit. And that could become a real game changer, is taking these innovative technology and process-centric approaches and then realizing that people, process, technology is a system, but culture, strategy, we'll eat strategy for breakfast. That's a famous quote, Peter Drucker and others, is that, culture, and if you've got a contracting environment that is pitting the members at odds on the project against each other, so that my gain, my additional cost is your benefit and my loss, the culture, the negative culture of negative accountability, and how do we get a better positive accountability culture in our collaboration must essentially come down to numbers. I mean, it's great to be part of a winning team, and that's a key part. And those that have been on projects know when you've got a winning team, you can almost feel it. But nevertheless, money matters and incentives matter. So getting the incentives aligned for improvement across the stakeholders, while still having the owners who are funding it have a decreased risk and be able to transition, which is kind of what IPD allows, is everybody benefits. And I transition from what's kind of like a lump sum approach of everybody's best estimate into, if things start going wrong, let's make sure nobody completely eats it. And when things go right, everybody shares some portion of their contribution to the total. So very, very much I believe that's the future, is that contracting strategy for incentivization with increased adoption, with people utilizing the tools to make it work, and that not being undercut, where I think technology is going to solve it on its own. Got to have the people side on board.
Ted, we have another question on how can you prevent indecision in the process, or how do you encourage agile decision making in the face of complexity and uncertainty?
Oh, I'm not sure that I've got a silver bullet answer like some of the other ones. That's a challenge for sure. And the magic crystal ball on it, I think it somewhat goes back to, there becomes a communication, and sometimes you don't want to escalate. I mean, observability is good, but if every single problem is being escalated up to the project manager, he's running around trying to solve everything. You gotta tear down that improvement process of solving problems to the right level, and then build a communication system where we get out of just emails and project reports escalating it to where the right problems can be solved at the right level with some amount of iteration and ability, but you've got to contain it, right? You've got to have something that's a sound plan of what is changing, and proper decisions of authority, of responsibility. You don't want to have a change in an IWP go all the way up to the project manager, but in some cases you might. And so having better decision support tools to allow that tiered decision making and visibility reporting, something in red to a work-based planner doesn't have to be displayed in red to the construction manager. Then if the construction manager can't solve it within one stakeholder company, and I now have to coordinate that constraint across multiple stakeholders, now I got to bring it up to the EPC level construction manager, or possibly the EPC or the owner, to say, okay, I've got things where it takes decision making across the stakeholders. And so bringing again that org chart and people into it around those teams of decision makers at the right level is part of the answer that can go in that. But that's a tough one to do. But certainly, the reality is the projects are facing the churn in the field now, and you're either going to pay for it by realizing later that things are slipping, or you're going to put early indicators, leading indicators that can show you where things are going to slip if you don't have the proper level of iterative planning and visibility on those plans up front. Great questions, by the way. Loving it. How are we doing on time?
We have 12 more minutes, Ted.
Yeah, love the engagement.
Perfect. And we have another question from Hamad Chaudhry, one of the VDC managers in Elliston. He's asking, have any owners reach out to you for consultation that you can mention or share? Have you seen any real estate developers take a front-end loaded planning approach for construction project?
Yeah, and then there were, number one is this initiative and my personal journey after kind of heading out of the company that acquired construction. It's been owner driven, and owners are now. In fact, I was on a beach in Bali and thinking I'd get right into the sustainability side of ocean cleanup. But again, my vision's always been capital projects. The key to success of the world isn't fighting the capital projects industry; it's participating in that. But point being, there was such a massive benefit seen on a project with Chevron that they decided that the lean and agile approach was going to be mandated. But it's again, the hard part was, how do we get the people to understand what they need to do and the procedures? You can't just say I want it, because then it can be gamed, and an engineer can say, oh, I'm going to now give you AWP and it's going to cost 2% more. And it's like, well, that wasn't the 2% wasn't engineering cost. In fact, those early Petro-Canada projects had to demonstrate that through automation, we could bring the data integration on engineering to save money, to pay for the tool, so that then the benefit of productivity would be, cream on the icing on the cake, not what is paying for it. And so, having those automation approaches and, the proper level of that being done, the owners have been the drivers. Dow did a programmatic approach. What's funny is Dow was in Deb McNeil was at that early FIATech meeting when I was still in the NASA incubator saying, whatever happened to the plastic models? We had these plastic models that used to help our teams plan and also the operations. And then 3D came and suddenly the plastic models were gone. And these BIM tools are for the engineers, are not for the construction and the project management. We've lost something here. And even now, I believe we're just at the verge of, with 3D printing, let's bring some of that back, but do it in a virtual environment too. And being able to have a virtualized environment so that the project management team can participate. That was one of the quotes from Chiyoda, is they drove the development of WorkPac's EPC. So the engineer and procurement side can be involved with the owner and actually use the model to do project management, not just do engineering. And that key part of driving that visibility into the engineering side and lowering the cost of engineering, not increasing the cost of engineering. Why would these techniques increase engineering? The same thing's going to happen in engineering. Certain new people need to get involved. They need to find the constraints between the vendor equipment over to, hey, this delay on vendor equipment might be delaying civil works on a whole other side of the plant. Let the computers help tie those dependencies out, but you can't take the need to put people on that debottlenecking engineering, and the same approach around debottlenecking the work-based planners can be applied to debottlenecking the engineers. And Dow understood that. They're an owner EP. And so as they came in, it was amazing to work with the team of very seasoned executive level support down to division level global improvement leaders for each of the different functions in that side of the EP process that said, how do we do this and not make it a money expense for us? We're not the engineer trying to make money on ourselves. We want to make engineering more efficient. I can guarantee you can make engineering more efficient. And Dow reported the highest benefits of AWP ever achieved. They were skeptical, and everybody should be. I wouldn't buy into it without seeing the results, but their results on the first project that they rolled out on was phenomenally more than anybody in CII had ever reported. But they did it right, and they did a data-driven approach. And what we learned, and I'm not sharing anything they didn't share at the AWP conference a few years ago, it goes back to this data side is, we think about this data as being, oh, well, that's just the computer doing stuff. No, there's people behind each of these boxes. Right? You come in and it's like you can't explain to everybody all. I mean, there's going to be a few people that become those process optimization, AWP, lean production, whatever you term it as your initiative. You're going to have a number of people that become the masters of that program that might be the AWP coordinator. but I'm a piping engineer. Just tell me what I need to do, right? My job's changing. What data do I need to provide, and who's giving me data to make my job easier? How do I get better data, from the structural team and the equipment vendors, because the equipment vendors holding me up on finishing my pipe. And so there's inter-team communication channels through all of these flows, and you've got to have somebody understand what they need to do without expecting they're going to completely become an expert. The project management framework needs to be and we came up with this concept of digital playbooks. Just tell me what I need. Give me the picture. I want to understand it, but I don't want to become the expert. I want to know what I need to do. How does my job change? And the reality is that's not a generality. That needs to be tweaked and tuned per project. Once you get it down as a system, and then I just mentioned a few owners, but ExxonMobil and there's an owner driven. Then back to the point of real estate, there's some, I actually predict that it's going to be the massive building of real estate where the economy of scale of some of these automation techniques, whereas even though residential was the last area to move on technology, and without naming names, there's a number of initiatives to automate the modularization and production planning of residential home building facilities, by massive large firms that, whereas the trailblazing of the technology really came in through the industrial plant arena. Kind of my concern is, are we stagnating there, and the other market sectors pick it up and can trailblaze it forward, versus all sectors starting to rise with the tide. But it definitively needs to be driven from a financial gain perspective and I'll go back to the point. I mean, at this point, we need to not just consider the financial gain, but the fact that, there are energy production and industrial facilities not only need modernization in this part of the world, but it's time to, get into, doing the right thing and doing it where, where we can turn sustainability. The way to empower a circular economy is to make it a money-making machine by the empowerment of a circular economy, by having the right decisions that say we're going to make money through sustainability, not make it a cost. And the same thing from performance improvement, and the owner and investors' decisions are essential to that.
Ted, we have one more question that I think you touched on this a bit. Would you mind commenting on the role of building information modeling for project success?
Yeah, and that's a real key one, is that, as we look at this flow diagram and you say, okay, this really represents the flows that are going, and saying, okay, what are the interchanges between the people, not just between the software, but what information does QA/QC need, and where is that coming from, and it being centralized not through a single software platform, but a cloud-based distribution network to achieve that optimization level that we're talking about. We need to model. So a computer model then not only mediates information exchanges between the project participants and supercharges the project management at different tiers of having the right information they need to make decisions, but you then model that network of people, process, and technology. What are they using? And then you can start to identify, a playbook's great. It can tell somebody what they need to do, but I can guarantee you, if they're not doing it, some benefit's going to be lost. And so suddenly taking leading indicators and associating leading indicators that can be weaned out of the data on, are the communication flows happening? And if they're not, you're unlikely going to get the benefit. I mean, your cost performance index and your schedule performance index and your productivity, those are measures that you see as a result. But what are the measures? And particularly with, I mentioned the software, O3 was one of the first startups out of the Jovian gate, where it's like, how do we model those KPIs and metrics so that then we can start looking at, am I doing what I need to do in order to get the results? And that is an area that then ultimately leads into further of that, into the AI infused approaches that wouldn't then be limited to just leading indicators and giving an owner oversight on the process, but beginning to go, how can I use machine learning even further to start streamlining communication flows, identifying bottlenecks, finding things that the human won't see until they have an impact, so that then I can start to mine that out. It's a very important process to model the performance improvement techniques of AWP itself on top of the project that's being, in essence, controlled and optimized. And that's a future layers that, you know, aren't yet there, but the structure of being able to do it is now in place. Some of the fundamental building blocks, how to do the proper, consistent work breakdown structuring across engineering, procurement, and construction, into commissioning, and not forgetting the startup angle, which went back to Deb McNeil, who's now at IPA, where, you know, as I came back into the FIATech initiative 10 years ago to help define these data centers, it was like, well, what about operations? We're not just doing this for the construction side, not just commissioning and startup, but I want to optimize that data into my facility and look at total life cycle cost and maintenance, not just operations, but maintenance, and how do I maintain my plant and then gain competitive advantage on use of capital during the operations of the facility for both maintaining and upgrades.
Thanks, Ted. If somebody has one quick question, I can give you the live mic to ask the question. We are almost at the time.
Great questions.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're
Ted,
welcome.
For the very informative and thought-provoking presentation. On behalf of SATE as well as the planning committee, I would like to thank you. And
you're welcome.
For the attendees, we have 3 breakout sessions coming up at 11 o'clock, one on dark web, one on virtual design and construction. Other one is how you can manage the teams. So you can join those sessions 5 minutes from now. And thank you very much, Ted. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you for having me present. It's been a pleasure.